Okay, and with that, it is now 8 o'clock, and I would like to get started because there's really quite a bit that I'm hoping to be covering tonight. Before we actually get into the presentation on critical theory and so on, I thought a little bit of background on how I got into this particular issue, and specifically critical race theory. I thought it would be worthwhile explaining my background and why it is that I thought I needed to begin addressing this. And it begins really with growing up in suburban New Jersey. I was in a town that was overwhelmingly white. We had a handful of African-American students in our high school. To the best of my knowledge, there were no particular racial incidents that occurred there. However, my mother taught in inner city Newark. She was a special ed teacher right in the middle of the ghetto. And when the riots broke out in 1968, my parents took my brothers and me and stuck us in the car and drove us into Newark during the day between the riots, basically to point out what was going on and to say, all right, you want to understand why this is happening on this street corner. This is what occurred. This store over here, this was the only pharmacy in the entire area. It closed down. One thing after another, where they were showing me what was going wrong and why it is that the riots were occurring. Now, I'm going to jump ahead. There are a number of other incidents which I may refer to during the course of this, but I'm going to jump ahead a bit to the fact that, well, I'm a historian. And I'm a specialist in 16th century Europe. And what that means is that I tend to think in long time periods. I don't, 5, 10 years, election cycles, things like that are blinks of an eye to me. I tend to think generally in 50-year blocks. It's just called an occupational hazard. And so when I look at the last 50 years in America, what I saw was an incredible amount of progress in race relations. America today is nothing like it was 50 or 60 years ago. There's been a huge amount of improvement, and that was the thing that I was seeing. However, I got challenged in talking to a few people that I might not actually have the whole picture here. And so I began with some of my students who are African-American, who I developed a good relationship with, and some of my friends who are African-American. I started asking them questions about their experience in life. What is it like actually growing up Black in America? And while I will still stand by my initial statement that we've made incredible progress since the 60s, there's a long way to go. And what I was seeing was how far we've come. What I was missing is how far we have to go. And so I started exploring those kinds of ideas. And as a church historian and part-time theologian, worldview specialist, things like that, I started asking questions about what is going on, how we should be thinking about it, how do we understand movements that are going on like Black Lives Matter and others. And that's really the origin of the presentation that I'm giving here. I thought a little bit of autobiography of how I got to where I am, and the way I've frankly been sensitized on some of these issues might be helpful. But the presentation itself is really going to focus on a few things. We're going to begin with sort of a big picture of an intellectual movement called critical theory, what that involves, where it comes from, those kinds of things, and some of the ideas that emerge out of that. From there, we're going to move into a narrower subject, critical race theory, which is critical theory applied to conditions surrounding race and race relations. From there, I'll move specifically into Black Lives Matter as a movement, which is one of the things that is really in the news quite a bit today. And then we'll finish up with the beginnings of a biblical response to this. We really need to think well and clearly from a biblical perspective about what is right and what is wrong within these movements. So that's where we'll go next. So that's the big picture of where we're going. Just so that you don't have to stare at my face all the time, I'm going to be doing this using a PowerPoint. So as soon as I can get that up and running, we will get started. Okay, the place we're going to begin is actually with a guy by the name of Antonio Gramsci. Now, we really have to start a little bit before Gramsci. We have to start with Karl Marx. And just as a quick review, I'm going to assume that you've got some knowledge of Marxism already. Marx believed that history moved forward on the basis of what he called class conflict. And this conflict occurred because of economics. Marx was an economic determinist. Everything in society came about because of economics. And he argued that what we really see in society is a battle between the haves and the have-nots. And society moves forward in progressive stages as more and more people grab control of economic power until ultimately all economic power will be in the hands of the workers. It's really the battle between the workers and the owners is what Marx was looking at. And Marx predicted that this was inevitable, that the revolt of the proletariat, the urban workers, was going to happen, and it was going to transform society. The problem is, it didn't happen. And Antonio Gramsci here was an Italian communist working mostly in the period after World War I, who asked the question, why is it that Marx's revolution never occurred? Why did Marxism fail? Why did that revolution never happen? And what Gramsci did is he argued, he changed the terms of the debate in a lot of ways. Where Marx argued everything was economics, Gramsci says, no, really, it's cultural. The issue isn't so much workers versus owners, but the ideology that underlies society. The ideology of the elite classes, the bourgeoisie, the owners, things like that, has captured the popular imagination, as it were. The workers have bought into the ideology of the owners. And unless or until you can break that, he called this the cultural hegemony, the cultural domination of the bourgeoisie. Until you could break that cultural domination, there's no hope for a revolution. This hegemony, this ideology is maintained by the institutions in society, it's maintained by the government, it's maintained by the schools, all of these kinds of things. And so, in order to break the control of the cultural hegemony, what you have to do is create a counter-hegemony. In other words, to come up with a new ideology to replace the one that is there already with the bourgeoisie. He saw this as happening through a union of intellectuals in the working class. And so the two of them together would create a new ideology, which would then infiltrate the institutions. And as they do this, it would undermine capitalist society from the inside. And ultimately, that is what would trigger the revolution. So the key thing in Gramsci, what he's doing is sometimes called cultural Marxism. The idea here, again, is he's shifting the terms of discussion away from economics and towards culture. And he sees the revolution as occurring primarily at the level of cultural conflict between the bourgeoisie and the workers. Now, that's a lot of jargon, but I think as we move forward, you'll see how this fits in with where we're going. Gramsci was an important influence on what we usually call the Frankfurt School. The founder of the Frankfurt School was a communist from Vienna, Karl Grünberg, who moved from Vienna to Frankfurt to Goethe University there and started the Institute for Social Research. When Hitler came to power in 1933, the institute, which had a large number of Jewish faculty members, moved to Geneva. And then in 1935, it went from Geneva to New York, where it became established in Columbia University. The Frankfurt School was influenced certainly by Gramsci's work, but also by people like Kant, Hegel, certainly Marx, and also Sigmund Freud in some kind of interesting ways. There's several other influences, but all of these people, we may touch on some of them again later, but all of these people have very direct influences on the way the Frankfurt School develops. Now, one of the key figures here in the Frankfurt School is going to be the guy on the right. That's Herbert Marcuse. But I want to start with the one on the left, Rudi Dutschke. He was not actually in the Frankfurt School, but Dutschke was a communist and particularly, again, influenced by Gramscian thought, this cultural Marxism thing. And he coined the term the long march through the institutions as the strategy that they needed to follow to bring in this new classless society. The term the long march was actually taken from Mao. Mao's long march through China is what is going to enable him ultimately to take over China in 1948. Dutschke, inspired by Mao, says we need our own form of long march, but it's a long march through the institutions of society. Remember what Gramsci said, the institutions will control the ideology. Herbert Marcuse, in his book Counter-Revolution and Revolt, picked up on Dutschke's term here. He advocated it, he was a strong proponent of it, and he popularized the term and the strategy. And in Marcuse's case, in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, he is pushing the idea of doing this through the use of media. Okay, he wants to capture the media to these ideas of, well, cultural Marxism or Gramscian thought. The thing about this is, within the Frankfurt School, this wasn't a new idea. Like I said, it goes back to Gramsci, but even earlier than this, we have Horkheimer here, who's one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, particularly in the US, who makes this comment: the revolution will not happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move toward universal egalitarianism. So what we see here is the three key institutions that they are going to work to control. In Gramsci's term, they want the robes. Okay, that's the faculty. He actually wants the clergy, but also the legal and political offices, which in Europe wore robes. And we add to those the media from Marcuse. So what you see, starting with a movement known as the New Left, is a self-conscious attempt on the part of people who hold to these views to gradually infiltrate these different institutions, education, media, politics. They're going to do this largely through the universities, where they will train up the next generations of people who will be leaders in these areas in order to promote their particular, well, counter-hegemony, their particular ideology. Now, this is a movement, like I said, known as the New Left. It was big in the 70s, 60s and 70s. And for anybody who is my age, you will probably remember some of this terminology. They argued that people were living with a false consciousness. What that boils down to, again, from Gramsci, is they're following the cultural hegemony. They bought into the American dream, which is really an illusion. They bought into the ideology of the elites. So what needs to happen from there is we need to raise consciousness, which means we have to alert the oppressed people in the country to make them aware of their oppression, and then have them develop class consciousness, the counter-hegemony, the alternative idea, a different vision for life, the culture, the country, all of these kinds of things. So through developing class consciousness, group identity, identity politics, these kinds of things, you can create the conditions that are necessary for a cultural revolution, again, borrowing the term from Mao, but preceding the Marxist revolution. We're still heading toward universal egalitarianism, which is the goal of Marxism, but we're doing it through this particular route. And that was what the New Left was about. They had their own approach to history, their own approach to, well, engagement, all of these kinds of things. Now, the New Left, the terminology is going to disappear, but it's going to continue on in the form of various types of postmodernism. And I'm not going to explain postmodernism. It's proverbially impossible to do, really, to define it. But what we see is a number of key concepts that emerged during this period that are going to shape the cultural consensus that is going to be, well, that is currently emerging today in movements like Black Lives Matter. The first of these is the idea that the world exists as a zero-sum game. Now, this is a term, the term zero-sum game means basically if for one person to win, somebody else has to lose. For one person to advance, somebody else has to fall behind. The zero-sum game, we see it most often in connection with economics. In economics, the idea is that, you know, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Or to be more precise in zero-sum game terms, the rich get richer because the poor get poorer. The rich are rich because they're taking money from the poor. So we talk about income disparity. We talk about the 1%, those kinds of things. And the basic idea is simple. If someone takes a big piece of pie, it leaves less pie for everybody else to have. Now, frankly, this is bad economics because the fact of the matter is you can open a bakery and make more pies. You know, it ignores the possibility of creation of wealth and things like that. There are a lot of reasons why this is mistaken in economics. But within the kind of postmodern world that emerges out of the New Left, this idea of a zero-sum game is applied systematically. It's applied to much more than just economics. So, for example, if one group has power in society, they had to get that power from taking it from someone else. So men have power because they've taken it away from women. Whites have power because they've taken it away from minorities. The Western world dominates the globe because it has taken power from other cultures, and so on. This is the way the zero-sum game works. And like I said, it is applied systematically and in ways that go beyond just simply power. Power is really the key word when we're looking at this particular worldview. As we're moving ahead with critical theory, power is going to be the critical term that you need to keep in mind. As I said, the zero-sum game is applied in some other areas, but in order to see those, we need to look at a few other ideas. The first of them is cultural relativism. With cultural relativism in this context, what it says is that all cultures are fundamentally equal. No culture is superior to any other. And therefore, particularly in the case of Western civilization, no culture has a right to dominate another culture. Because they're all equivalent. There is no fundamental difference. There's no such thing as an absolute right or wrong. There is no such thing as, frankly, good or evil. Everything is determined by history, by geography, by what works in a particular environment, and you can't claim anyone is superior to any other. Which raises real problems when, for example, Western cultures begin dominating the globe. More on that in a moment. The other key concept here is one called intersectionality. Intersectionality is built around the idea that, as it says in what you see here, all oppression is connected. Remember I mentioned before that when we're dealing with critical theory, everything really revolves around power. And particularly when you add in the zero-sum game, it is some people taking power from other people. So intersectionality, since it's all about power, does it really matter if it's a man taking power from a woman or a white taking power from a person of color or whatever? It doesn't matter. It's all the same functional process. and therefore all oppression is really connected. Intersectionality shows up in some very elaborate ways. This, you can see the source for this. This is an example of how intersectionality works. The basic idea here is you, above the horizontal line of domination there, you have people who are taking power from the people below the line of domination. So what this means then is that pretty much everything that we can see in culture is really a matter of domination, privilege versus oppression. And this plays itself out in some important ways. I'm not going to spend much time with this here, but let's talk about what this means in practical terms. First of all, your identity is really based on what intersectional categories you occupy. You are, your race, your gender, your, any of these things that you see in intersectionality are not aspects that are incidental to who you are. They identify who you are. That is, your identity is defined by that chart. That's really all there is to it. Now, the key thing here is bringing in the zero-sum game. You lose authority from the oppressor categories. In any area where you are an oppressor, you lose moral authority. But since it's a zero-sum game, the lost moral authority has to go to somewhere. So the moral authority you lose goes to the people you've oppressed. Similarly, you gain moral authority from being in one of the oppressed categories. Thus, the more oppressed categories you're in, the more moral authority you've got. So for example, let's take a concrete example. I am a white male. I really don't have much in the way of moral authority there. A white woman will have more moral authority than I do, all other things being equal, because she's female and therefore oppressed, whereas I'm male and therefore an oppressor. An African-American man similarly will have moral authority because he's a person of color and I'm white. He'll have moral authority that I lack. But an African-American woman has more moral authority than the African-American man or the white woman because she is at the intersection, hence the term intersectionality, of two categories of oppression. She is simultaneously a woman and a person of color. This gives her additional moral authority to speak into situations in the world, particularly those that affect her. If she was a lesbian, that would add another layer of moral authority, and so on. So the more oppressed categories you're in, the more moral authority you have, the more authority you have to speak. Now, the other part of this that is important to recognize is that when we talk about cultures and saying, all cultures are equal because fundamentally there's no absolute right or wrong, good and evil are themselves social constructs and so on, there's one exception to this. Oppression is evil. That's why oppressing people gives you makes you lose moral authority. Oppression is the sin in the system, and oppression is really defined primarily in terms of taking power from another person. So if oppression is sin, salvation really comes if your identity is above the line of domination. If you are a white male, if you're a white heterosexual male, able-bodied, young, attractive, all of these kinds of things, you have all kinds of categories of potential oppression here. The way you achieve salvation, the way you get rid of your sin is by becoming, well, woke or an ally to people who are below the line of domination. So there's actually a quasi-religious, not officially religious, but a quasi-religious dimension in all of this, in that it offers a way of salvation for those who have sinned by being part of an oppressive system. Now, in some versions of critical theory, you can never really get rid of your identity. The fact that you're in the identity of a white, heterosexual male, whatever. In some versions of critical theory, you can never really escape that. We'll deal with that one a little more later. But for the moment, just note that when people talk about being woke or talk about being an ally or whatever, what they're really referring to is this idea of forsaking your privilege from being above the line of domination and embracing the cause of those below it. And that, like I said, functions as a kind of secular salvation. Now, the goal of intersectionality is what I refer to as creating communities of virtuous victimhood. Virtuous because these are people who have moral authority. And this extends really across a wide spectrum of causes that exist in America today. So feminism, women are victims of male oppression. LGBTQ+, victims of heteronormative oppression. People of color, victims of white oppression. Muslims, victims of Western oppression. Actually, this would apply to any non-Western culture. Pagans present themselves as victims of Christian oppression. Undocumented workers, victims of American oppression. The poor, victims of corporate oppression. The planet, victim of industrial oppression. So all of these different causes, you will note that they all sort of merge in the politics of the left. All of these different things, or at least the majority of them, come together in the politics of the left because it's built around this fundamental idea of intersectionality. So the goal is to create a coalition of the oppressed to, using the terminology from the 60s, to raise consciousness so that they're aware of their oppression and can produce the counter ideology to end oppression, which is really the goal. It's to end oppression. Now, so that's the big picture in terms of critical theory. Let's move on to the issue of critical theory and race. Now, one of the important contributions of critical race theory is the idea that race is a social construct. And it seems to me that this is absolutely correct. Critical race theory really pioneered this idea, and it seems to me it is absolutely correct. Race is not a category that comes out of biology. Vodi Bakum points out that really we are all the same color because the color of our skin is determined by melanin, and all we are different shades of one color. We've either got more or less melanin, but we're all on a spectrum. There's no category biologically that defines one race from another. Everything exists on a spectrum. Hair color, eye color, hair texture, skin color, all of these things are on spectrums. So where you draw lines is really arbitrary. There is no biological foundation for race. And along with this, we need to take a look at the history of the word race, because it didn't always mean what it means now. If you go back to the early modern period, which is my area of specialty, what you will find are discussions, particularly as you're moving through the 17th, 18th century especially. You run into people who talk about things like the British race, which is distinct from the French race or the German race or the Italian race. Race was used essentially as nationality, culture, something along those lines. However, as you're moving into the 19th century, the terminology surrounding race changes. Race it's the creation of something that's technically called scientific racism. It emerges during this period in which there's a new approach to anthropology that says that humanity divides up into distinct races. And traditionally there were three of these. You had the Caucasoids or the whites, you had the Mongoloids or the Asians, and you had the Negroids or the blacks. And these three races existed. The purpose of creating this distinction between races really had a lot to do with European neocolonialization. During the 19th century, industrialized Europe began to increasingly dominate the non-industrialized world in Asia and Africa, and continued doing it in the Americas. Now, the problem is, how do you justify this? I mean, we can go back to also the African slave trade. How do you justify the African slave trade? This was increasingly under attack in America. It had already been abolished in Britain by the time a lot of this terminology is sinking in. Well, that's where scientific racism comes in. Scientific racism was created. The concept comes from the idea that some races are better than others. This is an idea you even see in Darwin, The Descent of Man. There are some races that are superior to others that can outcompete the others, and therefore they have a right, frankly, to dominate the others. And this can be put in terms of the white man's burden from Rudyard Kipling. We need to civilize these people. We need to bring them the benefits of white civilization or whatever. There are a lot of ways they put it. But the fact of the matter is, the entire concept of race was created to support what we would today describe as racism. And I would argue that anytime you put a strong focus on race as a critical category, you are going to, sooner or later, and usually sooner, head toward racism. Now, from here, we have to get into the problem of the definition of racism. The old definition was that racism was the belief that a person's ability, their value, their worth, those kinds of things were determined by their race. So whites were worth more than blacks. Whites were superior to blacks. It carries this idea of viewing the other as inferior. There's a new definition that has emerged, though, that really changes this in substantial ways. And the way racism tends to be used today is following this new definition. In the new definition, you do not necessarily have to even think in terms of superiority or inferiority. Instead, it becomes a matter of power. Once again, we're back to the idea of power from critical theory. The new definition of racism talks about the structures that exist within society, the institutions in society, even to some extent the ideology in society that is set up in such a way that it favors one race over another. You don't have to be explicitly racist. You don't even need to think in racial terms or think about race necessarily to be a racist by this definition if you participate in a system that advances one group, that gives one racial group privilege and deprives other groups of that privilege. And this brings us then to the idea of, again, using Gramsci's terminology, of a cultural hegemony. The world we're living in America particularly, is a world characterized by white supremacy and white privilege, according to critical race theory. Now, what does that mean? Well, white supremacy culture, this is one definition of it I pulled off the web, involves a whole bunch of values and modes of interaction with other people. So you can see a list of them here. I'm not going to go through the whole list. I will note worship of the written word, meaning it values literacy. But the one I'm going to highlight in more detail later is the second to the last, belief in objectivity. If you believe it's possible to be objective about something, that is a mark of white supremacy culture, according to this analysis of white supremacy. You also see it in things like this. Now, this is done as a pyramid. You should really think of it, I suspect, as an iceberg. Overt white supremacy at the top of the pyramid here is the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole lot of what they call covert white supremacy that is below the surface, that is less visible, and that's more or less socially acceptable. And again, you can see, I'm not going to go through all of these, you can see a rather long list of them, but I would point out in particular that the idea of color blindness, that what we are about is trying to create a colorblind world, is a mark of covert white supremacy. Because in this analysis of it, that is a way of saying that whiteness is normal and everything needs to conform to that. Okay, so there are, like I said, there's a whole range of things here that we could talk about. I'm not going to go through them. The point here is to show you just when they use terminology like white supremacy in critical race theory, it covers a wide range of ideas, of practices, of values, and so on. It is not simply the crude stuff that you see at the top of the pyramid. Now, along with this, I want to back up and take a look at this issue of objectivity, because there's something really important that's buried in this that it's easy to miss. In a postmodern world, in the world of critical theory, objective truth is frankly inaccessible. This goes back to Kant. It comes through postmodernism. It's all part of what's involved with critical theory. Truth is something that is subjective and it is personal. Objectivity, therefore, is essentially impossible. If truth is subjective, you can't really talk about objectivity. The criterion for determining truth, especially in society, is experience. So the African American community, specifically when we're dealing with critical race theory, or the Latino community or whatever, have a set of experiences that convey the truth of the racial situation in America, racial attitudes in America, that is frankly inaccessible to whites who do not have the same kind of experience. Now, what this does is it sets up what I call the narrative. The narrative is an authoritative interpretive structure for experience. Experience is not self-interpreting. The narrative gives you a framework for understanding what those experiences mean. It grows out of the experience in principle, but in practice, what it really does is tell you what that experience means. And the narrative is really supreme when it comes to critical theory. And there are different narratives for different groups. It's in critical race theory, but it's in others as well. The narrative is supreme. The narrative is the thing that really tells you what's true. Statistics that don't support the narrative don't matter because statistics buy into the myth of objectivity. If the statistics support you, that's great. But if they don't support you, you can safely ignore them because your experience trumps the statistical realities, the statistical numbers that are brought forward. Objectivity doesn't really matter. Now, what this means is there's no real possibility of shared truth. We all live functionally in different worlds. We're locked into the world of our experience. I can never really understand the experience of a Black or a Latina or an Asian or anyone else that has a different life experience and a different narrative coming out of that life experience, which makes it very, very difficult to actually, I would argue, make any kind of progress here. But this is where these ideas functionally lead when experience becomes the criterion of truth. This is what Vodi Bakum, again, calls ethnic Gnosticism. That you have, as Gnosticism refers to the idea that there's a kind of secret knowledge that you have. In its original form, it's a secret knowledge that is necessary for salvation. What he means by ethnic Gnosticism here is the idea that there are truths that are only only accessible to people from the appropriate ethnic group because they have a lived experience that is different, and that is the criterion for truth. So any claim, any use of statistics, the counter arguments that come up here, any claim to objectivity is immediately ruled out of court as an example of white supremacy. Now, another element that comes up in here is the idea of institutional or systemic racism. The basic definition of this, and this is part of what I said, the newer definition of racism. The basic definition of this is racism that is embedded in social and political institutions, the criminal justice system. This is why so many African-American men especially are incarcerated. Racism in employment, in housing, in healthcare, in education, in all of these different areas. And the idea, again, is that because of the white hegemony, because of white supremacy and white privilege, the structures of society are fundamentally corrupt, they are fundamentally racist, and they keep people of color down. Now, I don't really agree with that use of the term institutional or systemic racism. So, for example, if we applied the same criteria for men versus women, you would have to argue that there is institutional sexism in favor of women because more men are incarcerated than women overwhelmingly. So if you just use the statistics, in terms of numbers, if you slice it a different way, you get a really different result that goes against the narrative. Having said that, I do believe there is a kind of systemic racism built into the culture. The example that I'm going to keep coming back to is the simple example of driving while black. Every African American male that I have spoken to, without exception, talks about being followed by the police, being pulled over for trivial or virtually no reason at all, to have the license, registration, and insurance checked. Many of them talk about the police searching the car for no particular reason, things like that. This is a phenomenon, like I said, that seems to be universal, at least among the unscientific sample of Black men that I've talked to. And this is something that my son, Brendan, who is white, has never had to face. Something I never had to face. So there is something that is happening here that is truly systemic, that is truly institutional in the police forces. Now, they may not have policy for this, they may even have policy against it, but in practice, there's something going on here, and there's something within the culture of that organization, that institution, that leads to this kind of practice. Now, I know you can quote statistics on Black criminality. I know you can do that, but the vast majority of young Black men are not criminals. And that kind of constant hassling, that kind of harassment, is not something that is going to help race relations. And in fact, it is that kind of thing that leads to the anger against the police that erupts whenever there is particularly a white on black shooting, whether it ends up proving to be justified or not. The reason is that the police are supposed to be there to defend the community, and the fact that they are instead hassling the community just makes the tension that much greater and the anger that much greater. So we have to be careful here. I don't think that there's institutional or systemic racism in the way that critical race theory talks about it, but there's a reason why they see it. I think that there may be other explanations at work here, and we have to take into effect the lived experience of people in the Black community who go through this kind of thing. Now, along with white supremacy, we can talk about white privilege. And here again, from a website, is a list of things that surround white privilege. The bottom line here is that white privilege means that you don't have to think of white as being a race. Black is a race and so on. White isn't a race. White is just sort of default. And everything in society seems built around whiteness. Okay? So your models of beauty, your standards of beauty are typically white standards, on and on and on. We can go through a long list of these things. That's how white privilege is defined in this context. It also would include things like not being pulled over for driving while white. So white privilege and white supremacy can sort of integrate. They do sort of work together here. Now, I'd like to point out one thing. The most extreme example of white privilege that I've run into, and the one that I found absolutely horrifying, is illustrated in this picture. The white woman in this picture is my daughter, Elizabeth. I took this photo in January of this year in Sierra Leone. We were traveling through Sierra Leone looking at the work a particular ministry there was doing. And we went to a number of schools. This is a picture taken at one of the schools. And at every school we went to, if the kids had an opportunity, they mobbed us. They were around us, they were touching us, they were high-fiving us, they were fist bumping us, they were shaking our hands, they were hugging us. They swarmed us everywhere we went. And I had assumed that this was because, well, in Sierra Leone, we're exotic. There aren't that many white people there. We're unusual, we're exotic. So this was just something kind of cool. That was awfully naive of me. When we got home, we got back to the ministry compound. We spoke to the wife of the head of the ministry, and we were telling her about what happened. And she said to us, What you don't know is that if these kids had diaries, they would record this date as one of the most important dates in their lives. They're going to go home and they're going to tell their parents, today a white person smiled at me. Today a white person touched me. Today a white person hugged me. And this is going to be a highlight of their young lives. I found that utterly appalling. That even in Africa, even in Sierra Leone, there is this sense of white superiority, white supremacy. There's something deep set in the culture, the mindset of that world in Africa that says they're inferior to whites. I find that horrifying. I cannot even begin to tell you how appalling that is to me. It's an extreme example of white supremacy. We don't see it in the same way in the United States. But we've got to ask ourselves the question whether or not there aren't at least some remnants of that still in place here. It certainly is not like it is in Sierra Leone, but I think it's worth noting that this is a problem that extends well beyond the United States. Okay, well, let's talk about the Black Lives Matter movement as a specific example of critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is pretty broad, it's pretty diverse. Not everything that I'm going to be saying here applies to the whole movement. There are a lot of different versions of critical race theory. But in terms of Black Lives Matter, I think Chris Brooks, who's an African-American pastor in Detroit and who does a radio program for Moody Radio, Chris came out with a statement that I thought was really good on this subject. What he said was Black Lives Matter is, he can embrace the slogan Black Lives Matter, but not the movement Black Lives Matter. Now, when the slogan Black Lives Matter emerged, one of the things that people made, Hillary Clinton even made this mistake. She said, when asked to affirm Black Lives Matter, she said all lives matter. And that got a lot of people really angry at her within the movement because it said basically she doesn't get it. Okay, and she's not alone. This is a common reaction that you hear, particularly among white conservatives, white evangelicals, white Christians. The way you need to think about it is this. If your child, let's assume you have several children, and one of them comes up in tears and says to you, "Do you love me?" Is your answer, "Yes, I love you," or is it, "I love all my children"? No, your answer is, "I love you," because that is what that child needs to hear to be reassured at that point. Now, I'm not comparing blacks to children. That isn't the point here. The point is that you don't need to affirm all lives matter when the question is, do you really care about the African American community? When that is the question, you need to affirm Black Lives Matter and leave it there, not move on to, well, all lives matter. That's just an utterly inept way of dealing with the situation, frankly. Having said that, the slogan is good. The slogan is worth saying. The movement is a problem, however, because the movement is deeply rooted in critical theory and intersectionality, which raises some serious issues if you're trying to approach this from a biblical perspective. So, for example, if you were to look at the blacklivesmatter.com website 9 days ago, you would see a number of statements that, when they were pointed out, were excised from the website, although they're still there implicitly. So the movement, quote, rejects the patriarchal nuclear family and says that children should be raised by a village, the village, the local community, to the degree that mothers and children are comfortable. Did you notice who's missing? The fathers are nowhere here. The nuclear family is the foundation for extended family all over the world in every culture. This isn't a matter of white, black, or anything else. This is kind of universal. You may have extended families, but the nuclear family is at the center of it. And fathers play a critical role in their children's development. For example, when you take a look at statistics, fatherlessness is a major predictor of poverty, a major predictor of criminality. Most rapists were fatherless. It is a major predictor for drug abuse. On and on and on. There are all kinds of pathologies associated with the absence of fathers. But because of cultural relativism and the ideas we'll see that all families should have equal outcomes, missing fathers don't really matter. And what we need is something that goes away from this very foundational element of society. You see strong support for LGBTQ plus movement as well. As a matter of fact, this last weekend in New York, there was a Black Trans Lives Matter march. So strong support for that. It is strongly pro-abortion, despite the fact that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist and a racist, and that a greater percentage of Black babies are aborted than other races. Early on in the movement leading into Black Lives Matter, you had a lot of anti-Semitic statements that were made by their founders as well. So there are real problems here with the organization and the movement. Continuing on, the assumption that all cultures and all household configurations are equal. So it doesn't matter whether the father's there. It doesn't matter whether there are two mothers or two fathers, or whether just one mother or anything else. We've got the village to raise the kids. All of these things, they should make no difference, and yet they do statistically. Their argument is that unequal outcomes, since all of these configurations are equal, if there are unequal outcomes, it has to come because of oppression. And so nuclear families, patriarchal households, as they call it, and things like that, are an example, ultimately, of white supremacy and racism, pushing those ideas. That's whiteness. And the question that I find most important here is, which Black lives matter? Do unborn Black lives matter? Do the lives of Black policemen matter? Do the victims, Black victims of crime, do they matter? Do the Black owners of looted businesses matter? Or are the Black lives that matter those whose deaths support the narrative? And the fact of the matter is that although Black Lives Matter, as near as I can tell, although Black Lives Matter thinks in racial terms, in actual practice, race is less important to them, or they would protest murder of some Black police officers just as much as they'd protest George Floyd. Instead, what's important for them is the ideology, it is the narrative, it is, well, the counter-hegemony, going back to Gramsci. That's what matters. The Blacks who are conservatives, who don't agree with them, and so on, they can be safely ignored as being not truly Black. Truly Black means supporting the narrative. Then you get the issue of white guilt. One of the problems, and I'm going to address this more in a bit, but one of the problems with the idea of white supremacy and the related ideas, white privilege and so on, is that pretty much inevitably when they're brought up in the context of something like check your privilege. They're brought up in the context of saying, you have no right to speak to this issue. You have no right to say anything here. You need to sit down and shut up. It's used, frankly, in my experience, most often as a weapon rather than, now the theory says that it isn't that, but in practice, that tends to be how it's used. And one of the effects of this is we see things like what you see in this picture. I would describe this as a struggle session. The term struggle session comes from the Cultural Revolution in China, where enemies of the people, which could be anything from Western educated people to Christians to capitalists, business owners, whatever, were put through ritual acts of humiliation where they had to confess all of their sins to people, and so on. And so you see what's going on here in this. Now, this is an extreme example, but you're seeing in this what looks to me more than anything else like a Maoist struggle session. And I'm not alone in this. Someone commented on my Facebook wall when I posted an article on this. He said, my grandfather went through a struggle session in China and did this just before they executed him. And then we managed to get to the United States. So this reminded him of what he had seen in China. Now, the problem with this is that in this version of critical race theory, you can never really escape whiteness. No matter how many apologies you make, no matter how much you do, in terms of apologizing, repenting from slavery and all of that, even though none of these people actually had slaves, you can never really get away from the fact that you're white. You lack your experience as a person of color. Your only experience in life is whiteness. And given that you are part of a culture, of a society that is built on systemic racism, you can never escape that either. So no matter how many apologies you do, there can never really be absolution for you if you're white. I would add a couple of other problems here. This apology does nothing to change the situation on the ground. This does not actually help anyone with problems of racism. It doesn't really do anything. All it does is create a sense of humiliation on the part of these people, and it doesn't fix anything. Further, I can guarantee that this kind of behavior is going to produce a backlash on a lot of whites that will turn them against a lot of the kinds of things we want to see happen in terms of racial reconciliation. This is just going to harden people against any attempt to find common ground with Black Lives Matter or other similar organizations. But perhaps the thing that I find most disturbing about this, even beyond sort of the practical things there, is that on a theoretical level, this entire approach denies agency to persons of color. What it says is that persons of color really are helpless victims of the whites. Their entire situation, everything about their situation is a product of racism. And therefore, it absolves them of any responsibility, of any guilt, but it also takes away their power. In a very real sense, this entire way of thinking about it, white supremacy, and there's an element of truth there, I need to say, there's an element of truth to that. White privilege, there's an element of truth there. But when you emphasize it to the degree that I see it emphasized all too often, what it really does is effectively disempower people of color. It says that they're helpless. And I find that, again, really disturbing. Now, having said this, there is a kind of guilt that we need to talk about, and I would describe this as evangelical guilt, and this is very real. Dr. Tony Evans made a comment about this. He said, if it wasn't for the failure of the church, and particularly the evangelical church, that supported practically and theologically a division between the races that should not have taken place, we would not have these problems. In other words, if the church had been doing what the church should have been doing for the past 100 years, we wouldn't be facing the kinds of racial problems we're facing today. So, since the church helped cause it, the church has to be in front fixing it. We have a responsibility here. Our failure to recognize a number of basic biblical truths within the Christian churches contributed to racism and has therefore contributed to the kinds of problems we're facing here. So what do we do? How should we be thinking about this? Well, first of all, I'm going to be critiquing here several different aspects of critical theory and providing a biblical alternative to them. The first thing that we have to insist on is that objective truth really does exist. God is a God of truth. Jesus is the Logos, the reason, the truth that comes into the world. He says, I am the truth. Objective truth exists. And there are different ways that we can reach elements of objective truth. As Christians, we believe that revelation is a road to truth. We know truth because God revealed truth to us. Along with that, we can look at reason as another way of finding truth. There are some others as well. Experience is important here, but experience is not the final word on what's true. And as I pointed out before, experience is not self-interpreting. Just because you have an experience doesn't mean you understand why you had that experience or what that experience means. So experience isn't the final word here. We need to look at experience, yes, but we need to look beyond it to revelation and reason. Further, truth matters in practical ways. We have to reject cultural relativism as Christians. It simply is not true. Not all cultures are equal. Not all cultures work as well. As a simple example, consider the Aztecs, who cut the beating hearts out of literally tens of thousands of people in sacrifice to their gods. That is a culture that, in all honesty, needed to go away. Not all cultures are equal. Not all cultures are things that we want to preserve. We have to reject moral relativism, because ultimately, if you're going to argue for moral relativism, there is no right or wrong. And Idi Amin was fine with slaughtering the people in Uganda. Pol Pot was fine slaughtering the people in Cambodia. And ultimately, if moral relativism is true, if there is no such thing as an absolute right or wrong, you have a hard time making a logical argument that oppression is wrong. So we need to reject moral relativism as well. And further, we need to recognize, again, in very practical terms, the equality of all family structures. There are some that work better than others. The best results come from a married mother and father, biological mother and father, raising their children. The evidence for this is very, very clear. This is what produces the best results. And the further from that you go, the more dysfunction you introduce to the family and therefore to the children. So truth matters in practical ways. Objective truth does exist. Truth matters. Okay? We can look further at a number of basic principles of how we deal with other people. The first of them is that in Scripture, human worth is based on the fact that we're created in the image of God. This is what gives human life its unique value in the world. After Noah's flood, God tells Noah, you can eat the animals now, but he adds, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, because man is made in the image of God. Now, what this means functionally is that when you attack another person from God's perspective, that is the equivalent of attacking him. And there's a lot of theology involved in the image of God. What it means, functionally, is that we're God's official regents, his representatives, his stewards on earth. And so when you attack us, you're attacking him. That's what it comes down to. And that's what God tells Noah in Genesis 9. It also then factors in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says basically, if you treat your brother with contempt, this is just the same as murdering them, because functionally you're treating God in contempt as well. You're just as guilty of dishonoring the God in whose image your brother is made. So the foundation for human value is the image of God, which is something that we all share. And this is where intersectionality becomes a bit of a problem, because, well, the entire concept of intersectionality, there's an element of truth in it, but it gets difficult, because anytime you take any of these intersectional categories and use them as a means of determining who is worth more than whom, I am white, therefore I'm worth more than a person of color. I'm male, therefore I'm worth more than a female. Anytime you do anything of that sort, you're violating the image of God. You're saying that these secondary characteristics, these secondary categories, are more important in determining human worth than the image of God that we all share. And that is idolatry, and that is insulting God quite literally to his face. So we need to start with this fundamental recognition that human value, all human life, it doesn't matter your stage of development, your age, your race, your color, your sexual orientation, it doesn't even matter your religion. Your worth is fundamentally determined by the image of God that you share with everyone else. So we are all, in fact, equal in terms of our worth, in terms of our value before God. Further, in the New Testament, Paul especially drives this home even more strongly by talking about our spiritual and moral equality. Bottom line here, we've all got the same problem. It's sin. And we've all got the same solution. It's salvation through Christ. So the New Testament takes this idea and drives it home even further. And because of these two things, because we're all made in the image of God and we're all spiritually and morally equal, I cannot view another person as in any way less than myself. And I have to treat other people as I want to be treated. This is the golden rule, and it is also a way of describing love as the foundation of ethics. We love ultimately because the people around us are people who are of incalculable worth before God. And love, by the way, in Scripture is not defined as emotions. It's not defined especially as words. It's defined as actions. So the actions we take to other people, regardless of who they are, have to be grounded in the ethic of love. And I would add the golden rule as a good rule of thumb for how to do that. But biblical principles extend beyond the individual. They're also corporate principles we need to pay attention to. The impact of sin is not something that is a purely individual thing. Sin certainly affects the individual, and we sin because the principle of sin is at work in our lives. But this principle of sin extends beyond the individual, and it embeds itself in the institutions, in the cultures that human beings create. Sin as a principle is not something that is limited to individual actions. It is something that is deeply rooted in all human institutions and all human societies, all cultures. And as a result of this principle, sin as a principle, sin with a capital S, call it, as a result of that principle being in place, sins in the plural are committed. So we have to recognize that there is sin deeply embedded in culture. Racism is an example of that. It is also worth noting that there are examples in Scripture, particularly Daniel, but there are a few others, where people confess corporate sin. They confess the sins of the nation. And this is something that we should take into account and we should pay attention to. It's not that we have to live in constant beating our chest over the sins that we can never really atone for. That's not what I'm saying, but there is a place of corporate confession of sin before God. Now, that's the impact of sin on culture, but there's also the impact of redemption. And one of the key things here, which actually has its roots in the Trinity itself, is the idea of diversity in service of unity. Now, we see this in, for example, 1 Corinthians, where Paul talks about the church as a body, and we're individually members of the body, and we all have different functions and different gifts and so on. We need a diversity of people within the church, a diversity of skills, gifts, talents, all those kinds of things to make the church work. I would argue, though, that it extends beyond that. We also need a diversity of churches in society, because the fact of the matter is, not everybody is going to worship in the same way. There are some people who really love liturgy. There are other people who like much more spontaneous, charismatic styles of worship. There are some people who like hymns and who can worship well with hymns. There are others who find that appalling and want to use other kinds of things in worship. Black churches have a very different culture from white churches, and you know what? That's okay. because we can have a diversity of churches in society. We don't all have to be the same. And further, we can have a diversity of cultures as well, because cultures can refract the image of God in different ways. I would argue that the diversity of human cultures reflects, all of the different cultures reflect some aspect of the good, the true, and the beautiful, some aspect of these things that are rooted in God himself. Because human beings made in the image of God created these cultures. So while there are things in all the cultures that need redeeming, there are sins in all the cultures, there are also things of great worth in all the cultures. And what we need to do is promote the good while we fight the evil. And so the diversity in service of unity also works in terms of cross-cultural kinds of things. Now, let's move beyond that to some specifics. I would argue that one of the things we really need to do is rethink race. Race is a problem, okay? It's a problem in our culture. And we should really think much more clearly about it and about what it means. Let's start off with the fact that it's not an objective biological reality. I've already talked about that. Racial differences are on a spectrum. We're all the same color, just different shades. Further, race is not a biblical category. You don't find discussions of race the way we use the word in Scripture. The only race that is talked about is the race of Adam. So the image of God is the source of human value. We need to just sort of not allow race to figure in our evaluation of other people. Now, having said that, critical race theory is correct. Race is a social construct. It is a cultural reality. It's artificial, but it is still a cultural reality, so we need to deal with it. But I would argue that since it's a cultural reality, what we need to be thinking about primarily is cultural change informed by Scripture. We need to go, you can't get to biblical solutions by using non-biblical categories. You can't get to a biblical solution by focusing on race and seeing race as part of the solution. You just can't get there. So these are some elements I think we need to consider in terms of rethinking race. We also need to rethink racism. Now, this is Wilfred Riley. He's a person of color. He's a political science professor at a historically Black university, Kentucky State University. And he recently tweeted this: 3 reasons modern problems in Black communities can't automatically be blamed on racism, as opposed to, for example, welfare, the welfare state, or other kinds of things. Okay? In other words, racism may not be the reason for all, note the word all, of the problems in the modern Black community. There can be other reasons that factor in as well. Right? He's not denying racism is a problem, but he's saying, look, we have to be careful not to say everything is racism. First of all, many of the problems in the modern Black community didn't exist when racism was much worse than it is now. And his example of that is fatherlessness. Okay. Secondly, few of the problems that exist in the modern problems that exist in the Black community, read the African American community, exist in Black immigrant communities. Ghanaians, Nigerians, a whole bunch of immigrant communities from Africa don't have the same kind of problems you see in African American communities. And third, these specific problems that exist, these modern problems in Black communities, are shared to some extent, at least, roughly the same extent, in poor white communities. And what that suggests is, now again, not to deny the reality of racism, not to deny that it is a problem, a cultural problem we need to deal with. But we have to be careful not to assign all the problems in the Black community to racism. There are other issues. Poverty, for number 3. Family structures that were destroyed, frankly, by the Great Society, in number 1. So there are other issues that are at work here. We need to rethink the reflexive reaction that can come up that blames all these problems on racism. I would argue we also have to rethink white privilege. Once again, race isn't a biblical category, but class and culture are. I would like you to consider a thought experiment. Who is more privileged? Malia Obama, a 21-year-old Black woman, or a 21-year-old white laborer? Who has more privilege? It seems to me that a lot of the things that we need to be thinking about are class and culture. Consider, for example, that the highest earning ethnicity in America is not European Americans, it's Indian Americans. There's something going on there that is different from race. I would suggest as an alternative to white privilege that we should start thinking in terms of African American disadvantage. Because I think this gives us a healthier way forward. Again, remember when we talk about white privilege, most often it's used as a means of attacking whites, telling them to sit down and shut up, check your privilege, that kind of thing. I think if we shift our attention to the disadvantages that face African Americans, we may actually have a more fruitful route forward. Consider, there are two ways of eliminating privilege. You can either take it away from the people who have it, or you can spread it to the people who don't. Of those two, I would argue the second is far and away the better approach. As an example, consider driving while Black. Once again, my easy example here. Is the solution to driving while Black starting to pull whites over the same way Blacks are pulled over, or is the solution to stop pulling Blacks over for trivial things? Seems to me the obvious solution is to stop pulling Blacks over. So in other words, you spread the privilege of being able to drive without harassing to the Blacks. And you know what? At that point, white privilege disappears because it's something that's shared by everybody. Similarly, if you take a look at the civil rights movement in the 60s, Martin Luther King's work was aimed at ending segregation, which is another way of saying eliminating the disadvantages that were placed to Blacks in terms of housing, in terms of riding buses, in terms of sitting at lunch counters, all of those kinds of things. Martin Luther King's approach was to spread privilege, not to eliminate it, using modern terminology here. He didn't speak in those terms, but that's functionally what it was. And Martin Luther King, okay, he was a man with flaws and all kinds of things that we could talk about, but one thing he was a very well-educated individual who knew Christian theology, who knew Christian history. His letter from a Birmingham jail is a masterpiece of a statement of Christian natural law theology anchored in the Christian tradition very, very firmly. And that approach leads to the idea of spreading privilege rather than taking it away. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm making an assumption here. The assumption is that whiteness ought to be the norm. The way whites are treated should be the norm for everyone. It's how everybody ought to be treated. I would describe this as an application of the golden rule. So what we need to think about then, I would argue, is finding ways to take away the disadvantages of that accrue to African Americans, or to put it differently, to spread privilege. Now, many of you are pastors. I would give a few ideas for how to begin with your churches this process of moving toward racial reconciliation. These consist of do nots and do's. Do not engage in drive-by ministry. What I mean by that is all too often churches will adopt a project, suburban church adopts a project in the inner city, they swoop in, they do the project, they leave, they pat themselves on the back, and then they never enter that community again. If you really want to work toward racial reconciliation, what you need to do is build long-term relationships with people in the African American community or the Latino community or whichever racial group you feel called to work with. You want long-term relationships, not drive-by ministry. Another thing you should not do, and this is less aimed at pastors and more to sort of the people in the pew, when issues of race come up, don't quote statistics, don't explain away racism. I've seen this way, way too much among Christians, particularly in the wake of the recent death of George Floyd. Well, it's not really a problem. There's this, there's that, there's the other thing. No. Whatever the statistics, there may be a place for introducing those statistics later, but mostly what we need to be doing is listening and learning, and we need to do that with humility. And particularly in the wake of someone being killed like George Floyd, we need to be weeping with those who weep. We don't need to be giving them all of the reasons why there isn't really a problem with systemic racism. Even if that's true, and I'm not entirely sure it is, that's not the time for it. The other thing that you should not do is present yourself as the great white hope. You don't want to walk in with the solutions. You don't want to walk in and say, I know how to fix this problem. What you want to do is, in the course of building your relationships with the community, you build ministry partnerships with them, and you let them guide you as to what the problems are, what is really going on in the communities, and then let them work with you to determine the best ways your church can partner with them to deal with the issues in the community. That, again, is going to prove to be a far more productive way of approaching this. Okay, so that takes us to the end of the presentation. This went a little bit long. I do apologize for that. There were, I noticed, a number of comments popping up during the Zoom, and what I want to see is if there are any questions in here. I'm in the chat area, and I am not seeing, let me see. Oh, is it white skin or being Americans that the Sierra Leone children are enchanted by? They didn't, I don't think they knew much about where we came from. And what Sante, the wife of the ministry leader, told me was it was a white person. It was the skin. That was what really mattered to them. You know, that a white person actually interacted with them in a friendly way. A lot of questions about whether this is going to be on YouTube. I don't know if it'll be on YouTube, but it will be posted somewhere. I did record it. So let's see. In a recent theology podcast, you mentioned how Black Lives Matter is largely shaped by Hegelian worldviews. And you mentioned that someone could approach the topic through a classical, medieval, or a Kantian worldview. Could you explain what that might look like? On the theology podcast, what I mentioned, where this question is coming from, is that when you look at critical theory, I mentioned, you know, Kant, Hegel, Marx, all of these people are important for it. Marx should be obvious here. Kant is important because there is this issue of objectivity. Kant says that you cannot, the world as it really is, the Ding an sich, as he says, the thing in itself, the real world is completely inaccessible to us because the only way we know anything is through our senses. So the only thing that we can really know is what he calls the phenomenal world, the world of appearances and things like that. This is the root to the idea that objective knowledge is impossible and that subjectivity is all that you've got left. So that's a Kantian, that's an element of Kant multiple generations removed from him that shows up in critical theory and critical race theory. From Hegel, we get the idea that culture is conflictual, that cultures are always in conflict. I'm not going to go through all of the elements of Hegel here, but basically what he says is that all cultures exist with contradictions inside them. Those contradictions lead to conflict. That's what moves you into new eras. And only once all the internal contradictions are resolved will you ever reach a situation of stasis. That conflictual side of things is, again, part of what is informing critical theory, because Hegel gets filtered through Marx, who gets filtered through Gramsci, who shows up in critical theory. This issue of conflict, in this case between oppressors and oppressed, or whites and blacks, that's where that comes from. Now, the alternative to this is really, there are ways of approaching this through medieval worldviews and lenses that I don't really have time to get into. But I would argue that fundamentally, especially, as I'm speaking to a group of Christians, what we've got to do is, well, what does Jesus say? He says, blessed are the peacemakers. What we need to be thinking about is not in terms of conflict, but how we can be peacemakers, agents of reconciliation. And I would argue that extends not just to God, but between peoples. The gospel is the one power in the world that has the ability to bring people who are radically different together. There really isn't anything else out there. And so the answer, I would argue, fundamentally really has to come from the gospel, from a vision of the kingdom, a vision of a full-orbed understanding of the image of God, all of those kinds of things. That's where you're ultimately going to find your answer. Whether or not we will ever reach that before Jesus returns is a different question. But nonetheless, it is something we need to be working toward. The medieval world had a concept of Christendom that would be kind of relevant in here, but I don't want to take the time to try to do that here, because I think there are some more questions that I can get to. Is the struggle session more like virtue signaling than actually doing anything tangible to solve problems? I would say yes, it is. On some level it's virtue signaling, but on another level, I think that there's something really deeply psychological going on here, where these are people who have been put in a situation where they are genuinely feeling overwhelmed by guilt. And this is an attempt by them to assuage their guilt. But in a lot of ways, it does end up looking a lot like a kind of virtue signaling. Do you believe that moral relativism, do you believe that moral relativism, where did it go? Moral relativism and cultural relativism are synonymous? I might have heard incorrectly, but it sounded like you were using them interchangeably just a minute ago. Do you think they're the same? I think they're kissing cousins. There is a technical difference between the two, but in a lot of ways, cultural relativism is built on a base of moral relativism. Cultural relativism basically says you can't judge another culture by its practices, and the reason you can't judge another culture by its practices is that there is no absolute standards of right and wrong, which is another way of saying that morality is relative. So the two of them are very, very closely related. Can I comment on the 1619 project? 2 words, bad history. I don't mean to be facetious, but the fact of the matter is it's just simply bad history. What you're seeing there is a good example of a lot of what goes on in academia, where pretty much all kinds of subjects are becoming politicized. And what you have there is a particular a particular contemporary agenda informed by critical theory that is being read back into history, into places where it doesn't belong. If this is recorded, how do we access it? I'm going to send a link to everybody. One problem I see with spreading the privilege is the notion of the zero-sum game. The zero-sum game is, what's interesting about this is that you won't find people talking about the zero-sum game in critical theory or in critical race theory. What you do is you see it in action. They don't actually say that's what they're doing, but you see it in practice. And the fact is, the zero-sum game is a fallacy. It is not reality. It is not the way economics work, for example. And I don't think it's the way privilege and power in society work. Just like you can make more bakeries, you're not stuck with one pie. So there isn't just one pie of power or privilege out there. It can be spread around. You can spread the wealth. So the zero-sum game is it's a good tool to use to understand what they're doing in critical theory, but frankly, it's a fallacy, and it's one of the reasons why critical theory goes off the rails, why it doesn't work. I find it difficult to figure out what it means to weep with those who weep. Yeah, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting to where I need to be here. The slide is really difficult to control. I find it difficult to weep with those who weep. I think this goes into the issue of struggle sessions. The thing is jumping around rather badly. All right, let's go back to basics here. The African American community has a history of bad interactions with the police. Some of this was from a period that was overtly racist. You know, you can look at what was happening during civil rights movements and marches and such in the 60s and see that. Others are past the point where it's overtly racist, but you're still dealing with people who are, you know, persons of color. If there's a stop and frisk policy, they're the ones who are stopped and frisked. They're the ones who are pulled over for little or no reason. There's this tension that exists within the community. And the tension is worse because the community knows the police theoretically are there to protect them. And yet all they're seeing happening is they're being hassled by them. They're being harassed constantly. In those circumstances, when particularly a white policeman shoots an unarmed black man, the community feels a kind of pain from it that we frequently don't appreciate because, frankly, we lack empathy. We lack the ability to put ourselves in their shoes and see it from their perspective. Now, there may be things about their perspective that's wrong, and those are things that you can talk about, but you don't talk about them while they are in mourning and grieving for the loss of life. At that point, you come up next to them and you act with empathy, you act with compassion, and so on. It doesn't mean that you buy into the whole program. It doesn't mean that you don't think that maybe whatever homicide we're talking about or whatever police shooting we're talking about, maybe it was justified. Maybe that's the case, but that's a discussion you can have another day. Right now, they're hurting and you need to act with compassion. Let me see if Black Lives Matter message has been co-opted by the Black Lives Matter movement or organization, perhaps there's better language to indicate the inestimable value of Black lives. That may in fact be the case. However, we've got the terminology Black Lives Matter now. This is the one that people recognize. This is the one that people are, this is the slogan. This is the stance that people are affirming. This is the language that's being used. And if you want to communicate, I don't have a problem with using the phrase. I will distinguish it where appropriate from the movement. I don't stand with the Black Lives Matter organization, but I affirm that Black Lives Matter, absolutely. You know, you can say things like that. But I think that there's I think it's unfortunately one of these necessities. We've got to deal with the language that we're given, and we've got to communicate in that language. Martin Luther King spoke about the most segregated hour is 11 o'clock on Sunday. Would you agree that it is still the case? And is that a problem that should be corrected given the idea you talked about in 1 Corinthians in the analogy of the body? Yes. This is one of these things that I have mixed feelings about. The fact of the matter is, if I went to a Black church, I would not feel comfortable. Not because the Black people there would make me feel comfortable, but because it is an entire approach to worship, an entire feel, an entire cultural experience that is foreign to me. I could probably learn to be comfortable in it, but it would take a while because it's cross-cultural for me. That's not a matter of racism. if an African American comes to my church and they're uncomfortable there, the question that I want to ask is, are they uncomfortable because we're the frozen chosen and this isn't the way they were used to worshiping? Or are they uncomfortable because we have made them feel uncomfortable as if they don't belong because of their skin color? If it's the first, I don't have a problem with that. If it's the second, it's a serious problem. So we have to, we have to look, I think, beyond the simple categories here and ask additional questions, ask deeper questions about why. If they're uncomfortable because they've been made to feel uncomfortable because they're Black, that is a serious problem. That is a sin that we need to repent of, and we need to root that out of our congregation. But if they're uncomfortable because they're just not used to worshiping this way, this just doesn't fit their cultural approaches and things like that, that's a different matter. So what I would affirm, and what I think it's important for us to affirm, is that there are different approaches to worship. There are other styles of worship. There are other ways of doing worship that are all legitimate. I mean, well, excuse me, not all of them. There are some of them that fall off the rails. But the umbrella of small O Orthodox Christianity can encompass a wide range of expressions of worship. And we need to recognize that and be good with that. This is one of the reasons why I don't think denominations are the problem some people think they are. Okay. Moving on. You said that your perception of there being something that makes racism present in places outside of the US came from your experience in Sierra Leone, but that was based on personal experience. And the woman who explained was likely communicating from her personal experience, not stats or empirical data. Why does this move you to see that there's something larger with racism going on even globally, but the experience of the Black community is not objective or empirical? That is a good methodological question. What I would say about this is that, once again, experience matters. The experience of the Black community is important. However, experience is not self-interpreting. So I don't want to discount the experience, but I think we need to interrogate it a little bit further. As, for example, the African-American professor I quoted was questioning whether, he doesn't deny racism, but he questions whether all of the problems are tied to race. In the case of Sierra Leone, the woman who told me that was a native Sierra Leonean. She was the head of a ministry that worked with people across the country and actually beyond, across Africa. She is someone who has had a lot of experience with church groups from America coming over there to observe the ministry and, frankly, to learn from it, which is why I was there. I wanted to learn from what they were doing. I trust her assessment of this. She seems to have a great deal of evidence to support that, and I think that that is, it certainly aligned with the experience in the schools. It explained that very well, and it explained some of the other interactions I had with Sierra Leoneans. So it made sense to me. And again, what I'm saying, don't hear me as saying experience doesn't matter. It does. And it's very important for us to take that experience into account and to take it seriously. But we also need to dig, and we need to ask other kinds of questions. I think the fundamental problem we're dealing with, because race is a social construct, I think the fundamental problem we're dealing with is a problem of culture. That's a biblical category. Race isn't. So I think if we think in terms of culture, it's probably going to go a longer way toward helping us find a solution. Again, think about Black Lives Matter. They're concerned about George Floyd. They're much less concerned about the half a dozen or more African-American policemen who were shot. I haven't heard a word from them about that. That suggests to me that something other than race is really behind this. not consciously, certainly, but it strongly suggests to me that there's something else beside race or beyond race that's going on here. Okay. I noticed you used race and racism. Let me see if I can get this one. The slide on this is really difficult to operate. Race and racism as terms, though you agree these aren't biblical concepts. Is there a reason you still use them instead of insisting on biblical terminology? The reason why I am using them is in the slide where I talked about this, I pointed out that as cultural constructs, they are artificial, but they are still things that are important elements within our society. So we have to deal with the fact that culturally, within our culture, these things are present. And so I think it's perfectly legitimate to talk about it in that context, although not in an absolute context of, call it objective truth or biblical truth or something like that. In our cultural context, one of the lies that our culture is bought into are these concepts. And since it is a lie that exists within the culture, we need to deal with it. Okay, I am 10 minutes past what I said was going to be my closing time. I'm willing to go on for a little while longer if you're willing to keep listening. So I don't want to hold you hostage. I'll continue on for a little bit longer, though, for those of you who would like me to. Okay, notice to use race and racism. I did that one. LaDonna, my experience in East Africa was that the children mobbed white people because they usually gave them things based on their experiences in the past. We were told a higher price at the markets because the understanding or experience there is that all white people have money. That's certainly true in some parts of Africa, but we weren't giving things out and that we were still being mobbed. Some leftist professors argue that cultural Marxism is a right-wing conspiracy theory. Have you encountered this argument? Yes, I have, and it's frequently associated with anti-Semitism because many of the professors in the Frankfurt school were in fact Jewish. I would argue that they are in fact wrong about that. How, Gramsci's theory, the term cultural Marxism, it seems to me is a perfectly legitimate way of describing it. I tend not to use the term, however, because of this kind of criticism and because there are people who take it in an anti-Semitic direction. That's why I focused the terminology on critical theory, which is the terminology they use and that they accept. I would argue that cultural Marxism is an accurate description of it, but I prefer to use the term critical theory to avoid some of those kinds of problems. Enjoyed this very much. No question here, just some thoughts. I live in inner city Akron and have attended 2 white-black reconciliation meetings, and they've been very helpful. I have a lot to process, but the question I posed twice and it hasn't been addressed is the problem of fatherlessness. Don't know if it wasn't addressed because they didn't get to it or if they are proponents of Marxist theory. I like the idea of image of God being the foundation of everything, that race is a social construct, that the golden rule should guide our actions. All right, a word on fatherlessness in the Black community. Marx, by the way, did argue that we need to break down the nuclear family. That is an element within Marxism. That's not how it gets to the Black community, however. And this is a personal story that I will tell that if I'd had time, I'd probably have included it on the main session. My mother teaching in inner city Newark. At one point, she was going to visit one of her kids, one of the students that she was teaching. And when she got home, she told me she met with the kid and his or her mother. I don't remember whether it was a boy or girl, but she couldn't meet with the father because the father lived somewhere else. And I asked her why. And what she said to me was, because of welfare. The welfare system is set up so that if the father lives with the family gets less money. The reason being they assume the father is working and therefore they don't need as much help. But there are no jobs. So in order to get the money they need to support the children, dad has to move out. Now, I said, this is crazy. And I was 10 years old or something. I said, this is crazy. This is nuts. And my mother said, yeah, but that's how the rules are written. And the rules are written that way to prevent people from cheating. So you've got a good faith effort here to be financially responsible and things like that. But what you have just done is driven the fathers out of the Black families in the inner cities. In 1950, the illegitimacy rate for Blacks was considerably lower than it was for whites. It was something like 21%, which was lower than it was for whites at that point. I don't remember the exact number. Right now, it's in the 70s. And the reason that's the case is because in their effort to provide for welfare for good, I'm going to give them, I'm going to assume good faith here. In their effort to help the communities in the inner cities and to be fiscally responsible, the law was written in such a way that it destroyed the African American family. And I've heard people say things like, you know, that is a crazy white supremacist argument. I saw it in action growing up with my mother's class. So why don't they deal with the problem of fatherlessness? It has become a norm within African American inner city communities, that's just the way things are done. And I don't think that they even themselves understand the problems and the implications of that. The best thing that we could actually do for the African American community is to work with them to help rebuild the family. Yet that's exactly what Black Lives Matter is opposed to. The irony here is that a lot of the pathologies that exist within the African American community, you know, criminality and things like that, with fathers in the home, married mother and father raising their biological children, those numbers drop through the floor. Drug use, you know, all of those kinds of things. They don't disappear completely, but they drop dramatically. But that's a difficult solution to sell. It's much easier to sell, it's not our fault. It's white supremacy. Now, again, you can make the argument that the welfare state itself is an example of white supremacy, and I wouldn't necessarily argue with that. But it's much more complicated than just simple racism. Okay, moving on. Gosh, I've got 38 new messages and a bunch of older ones. A bunch of these are thank yous. Potentially helpful perspective on I lost it. Potentially helpful perspective on Black Lives Matter statement about family. You know what? I'm having trouble with this. The problem is I've got this I've got so many chat messages and this very, very tiny thing that I've got to slide to see them, and it's jumping all over the place when I try to move it. Perhaps intentional inclusion of mothers would be akin to hashtag Mothers Matter. It's not that fathers don't. It's likely a way of saying that Black families, even if hurt from absent fathers, can heal, be whole, and lift each other up through the entire village. A concept not absent in Christianity, where we all are all spiritual fathers, mothers, brothers, and so on. I suppose that's possible, but I see no evidence anywhere of a statement of support for fathers. It may be possible that that's what they're trying to do, but like I said, in the complete absence of any reference to fathers, I find it hard to make that argument, make it stick at least. Do you think the reason that there's more fatherlessness is mostly the welfare system? I actually already answered that. Also, as abortion became more marketed to those in poorer neighborhoods. Yeah, the fact of the matter is, if you go back to the origins of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger was big on the idea of limiting the population of undesirables, which included the poor, it included racial minorities, and included the handicapped and so on. So it's not surprising at all that abortion mills tend to gravitate toward low income areas, because this is, they're what they tell themselves, I suppose, is that they're helping them because they can't afford to have more children. Given the roots of the eugenics of abortion in the eugenics movement, I suspect that there's more to it than that, whether they're even consciously aware of it or not. A few more thank yous here. Let's see. From a historic perspective, with the focus on getting rid of the patriarchy in the Black Lives Movement, would this be third or fourth wave of feminism? I've lost count. I'm not going to try that. There are multiple waves of feminism, and I'm not sure which one's which at this point. But yeah, the thing we have to be careful about is that feminism, as we usually think about it, is primarily a white elite movement. And it's the interaction, as near as I can tell, the interaction of feminism with the Black community is not simple or one-to-one. So I'm not sure that, when we talk about first wave, second wave, third wave feminism, I'm not sure that we can really use that terminology with respect to feminism in the Black community as much as within the white community. And that is looking like actually the last message that I've got here. I'm going to really take a risk at this point, and I am going to, if there are any other questions, I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself and ask. Do it verbally rather than trying to read them. So do any of you have any other questions or any other things you'd like me to address? There's so many different directions this could have gone. I was kind of hard pressed to figure out how to narrow it down to the essentials.
I had a question.
Hi, Heidi.
Hi. I was the one who wrote, I have trouble figuring out what's weep with those who weep and what's wearing an I'm sorry t-shirt. I participated in a race reconciliation meeting more than a decade ago that was very much like a Maoist struggle session. And I'm looking for more practical and constructive ways of participating, but I don't see where those are.
Yeah, that's not the easiest question to answer, because right now we are so polarized and there is so much tension that identifying those places where we can do that is difficult. I would argue, for example, that attending peaceful protests is, where appropriate. There are times when that is an appropriate thing to do. I think personally that the best way to approach this for most of us is not in the large organizational kinds of things, but it is working one-on-one to build bridges. So, in my case, the way I became, frankly, aware of a lot of this, I was aware of racism growing up in the home that I grew up in, seeing it in Newark in the riots in '68. I was aware of this all my life. But it wasn't until I started building one-on-one relationships with people that I began to understand what it means today and not in 1968. So I think that building friendships with people of color, asking them about their experiences and so on, is probably the best way to begin this. my point on weep with those who weep is when people are really angry and upset about George Floyd, that's not the time to get into a debate on whether systemic racism exists. That's really the key point there. One of the things that's a problem, by the way, I'll let you know right now, one of the things that's a problem with this is if you remember the pyramid on white supremacy that I said really should have been an iceberg as an illustration. If you remember the pyramid, one of the things that is an example of covert white supremacy is asking people of color to educate you. This poses a significant problem because how am I supposed to learn about the experience of people in the African American community if I don't ask them about it in the hope that they'll explain it to me? Now, when I don't know what they mean by that. Does that mean strongly insist that you have an obligation to do this? Or does it mean, hey, Chris, can you, talk to me about this? What's been your experience with this? I really want to know. I want to understand it. When Chris is a friend of mine. I'm not sure what that means, but that it seems to me is one of the unhelpful things that show up in that pyramid. It raises all kinds of different problems. So to answer your question on weep with those who weep, what I really mean is don't tell them they're wrong or that they have no right to feel the way they feel. But at the same time, you should be working, even at other times, and maybe especially at other times, to build those bridges, those relationships of trust where you can have some of these uncomfortable conversations. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Yeah, Davis.
Regarding the response of the church, it's kind of everywhere in between. Some people don't want to address the issue at all. Some people have gone full-blown on the woke side. I was wondering, in your opinion, what is probably one of the more foundational issues regarding the poor response from the church, or perhaps the lack of preparedness? I had a couple ideas. Is it perhaps a lack of understanding in how justice, genuine, real justice, is rooted in the application of God's law? Is it a lack of basic discipleship concerning how the Bible relates to all of life? Where has the church gone wrong? Because obviously this didn't just happen with George Floyd. It didn't just happen with Trayvon Martin. We've been making this bed for probably 20, 30, 40 years. So
you got to push it several decades further. This is a problem that goes back probably for over a century. Actually, no probably about it. You can trace this back like forever in America. The problem is there are multiple things here. And I could get into the history, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to answer for the here and now. The problem that we have in the church is, I would argue, fundamentally a misunderstanding of the kingdom of God. When we talk about the kingdom, what does that mean? What does that mean for discipleship? What does that mean for our unity with brothers and sisters elsewhere in other communities? What does that mean for our responsibility in our own community and our responsibilities to people who are genuinely oppressed? What does it mean for our responsibilities to the poor? Or, for that matter, to the handicapped, the mentally handicapped, not just the physically handicapped? This means our responsibilities to them. We need to understand the kingdom of God, and with that, I suppose, the image of God. We have virtually no teaching on either of those subjects in most churches. I don't know how many people I've talked to who have said, I have never heard a sermon on the kingdom of God, what that actually is. I don't know how many people have told me I never even thought about the image of God. Those things are so foundational to everything that it's almost inconceivable to me that the church can function without really paying attention to them. The other problem that we have in sort of as a short-term problem is actually a misapplication of some missiological principles. There's a guy named Donald McGavran who did some really important work in missiology, in which he said basically the best people to reach people are people within their own culture. You do outreach best within your own culture, or the next best is in a culture that is close to your own. So this idea was then picked up by the church growth movement. And what emerged is a whole lot of white suburban churches who said that basically, according to Donald McGavran, the best people for us to go to do outreach to are people who are like us. And so what we really want to do is attract more, ideally upper middle class or wealthy white suburbanites to our churches. And we will build our churches in such a way that we will attract that group to them, because that's the most effective way of doing outreach. McGavran would, well, I strongly suspect that when this started happening, he started, well, turning over in his grave, I think is really about it. Because that is utterly not the point that McGavran was trying to make, but that is the point that people took from him. So the net result is, along with the basic problem that churches were always in communities and communities tended to be segregated, we now have a justification coming from the world of missiology to ignore the problems of minority churches. Because different culture, big cultural divide, we're not going to be effective in reaching that community. We should really stick with what we're good at. Complete violation of everything that we see Jesus teaching and the example of the church in Acts and elsewhere. So there are a lot of different factors here. These are just a handful of them. You know, the fact is that our churches have been there are so many deep-rooted problems, worldview problems and other kinds of problems in the American church, it isn't funny. You know, again, this is one of these things where I do entire presentations on how the evangelical church in America has bought into both secularism and anti-supernaturalism, and then a host of pathologies that follow from there. You know, that's a whole nother lecture. All of these things are part of the problem. You know, we really need to go back to basics. We need to go back to blocking and tackling. And reroot ourselves in, I mean, Jesus's entire message was about the kingdom of God. We're much more comfortable in the evangelical churches preaching Paul than we are preaching Jesus. But which of them is Lord? We need to go back to the teachings of Jesus. We need to go back to the teachings of the kingdom and what true discipleship is. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, so recently I was able to do a lot of public square stuff that has nothing to do with anything we're talking about tonight. So in our church network of a couple dozen guys, we've been talking about race for a couple weeks every Wednesday when we have our meeting. I'm just wondering where you think the pastor can fit into the public square on this, meaning outside of the church in a public forum. How can we help be the leading forefront of society, not just our churches, on racial reconciliation?
The short answer is you lead from the front. Actions speak louder than words. So what you need to do, I would suggest, I'm hardly an expert on this, but what you ask my opinion, what I would suggest is that what you need to do is start building those bridges to the African American community and show by example what this looks like. I would suggest there's a really good case study of this. Roosevelt High School in, I think it's Seattle. Look it up on YouTube. It's a rather long documentary about a white suburban church that adopted a school. And they did it right. That's the kind of leading from the front that I think we need to be doing because, well, all right, think about what Jesus did. Jesus healed the sick, raised the dead, cleansed lepers, cast out demons, and he taught and preached. Preached the kingdom, the gospel of the kingdom. What I would, the way I would, and oh, by the way, then when he sent out his disciples, he told them, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons, and preach. He told them to go out and do exactly what he had been doing. Now, the way I summarize that is that the way you spread the gospel is show and tell. You show the reality of the kingdom. You show what the kingdom looks like, and you proclaim it. But it's interesting when you look at particularly Luke 10, when he's sending out the 70, he does it in that order. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons, and tell them the kingdom of heaven is at hand. In other words, at least with the 70, he suggests that you show them what the kingdom looks like, preliminary to telling them about it. Your words and your actions have to work together. So your first step here, I think, is to work with your church to build those bridges into the community, the African American community, or whichever community you're looking at. Build those bridges into the community so that you can demonstrate what it looks like. And that's going to give your words a whole lot more authority than if you just speak in the abstract. Anyone else? Going once, going twice.
Yeah, I got one question. My wife and I just
Sam, you're gonna have to speak up a little bit. I'm having some trouble hearing you.
Is that better?
Yeah, a little bit. Okay.
Okay. My wife and I just left a church that over the past 8 years has transitioned to a fully, pretty much almost a fully woke church. And it's not the only one around. How does the church change once they've moved into that thinking that they start focusing people on, for example, they're starting a group, using a group called Be the Bridge, and I heard last night from a person that's been through it that has kind of left critical race theory now and said the first portion of when you go through the program, a white person cannot say anything because they have too much privilege and they have to renounce their white privilege. And so how does the church, how do we get away from this? It just seems like it's rolling so fast now.
I don't know how you turn around a church that's gone in that direction. What would end up, I think what would need to happen is you would have to wait for new leadership. And then they would need to call a pastor that was more biblically sound. My personal guess, particularly in the wake of the most recent Supreme Court decision, my guess is that we are going to be moving away from the kinds of churches that we are familiar with, and we are going to have to move toward more house church type structures. Because given the Supreme Court decision and the things that are going to follow it, there is going to be increasing legal and social pressures on the churches to go in that direction. And if you want to remain biblically faithful, it's going to be harder and harder to do that. I suspect we're going to have to follow what's going on in a good chunk of the rest of the world, including the places where Christianity is growing the fastest, and move toward more of a house church structure, because a lot of our churches are about to come under siege if they want to stay faithful. Okay, I think we're going to call it a night here. We've gone actually considerably over. Thank you very much for your patience and for staying on board and listening, and I hope some of this was useful. I am going to be, once I get this edited a little bit, I'm going to be posting it. I'm not sure whether it's going on YouTube, Vimeo, or my own website, but one way or another, I'm going to send a link to everybody. And if you don't get that within a week, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my my email client. It didn't actually get the email out to everybody. So if you don't hear from me, if you don't get that video within a week or a link to the video within a week, shoot me an email and I will send it to you directly. Okay, so thank you very much. Have a good night. Appreciate you coming.